Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jen Lopez. I'm with Project Moxie, and we're happy to be hosting this event, conversation, and educational forum on an affordable housing ballot in Colorado. I'd like to do a shout out to our sponsor, the Colorado Health Foundation, and it's nice to see Kyle on with us, our collaborator on this initiative. You're going to be hearing about a pretty interesting opportunity for increasing housing, affordable housing, workforce housing in Colorado. And sort of the ins and outs of this ballot measure. I'd like to go through some of the housekeeping, but before I do that, I want to introduce Anna, who is our translator for this evening. Anna, would you like to say hello and get everyone set up who's Spanish speaking?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Anna. I'm here with the Community Language Cooperative, and we're here to help create a space for language justice. What this means is that we want to create a space where everyone can participate and engage in the language of their heart desires or the language that they feel most comfortable in. We will use simultaneous interpretation to create the space. When I finish saying this in Spanish, we will turn on interpretation and you will see a globe icon that says interpretation. If you are not fully bilingual, we ask that you select your preferred time and your preferred time language. If you are bilingual, feel free to listen to everyone in their language. When you select your language, you can check out mute original audio so you don't hear both languages at the same time. Hola, mi nombre es Ana. Estoy aquí con la comunidad Lenguaje Cooperativa y estamos aquí para ayudar a crear un espacio donde practicamos y compromiso de la justicia del lenguaje. Sorry, give me 1 second. Lo que eso significa es que creamos un espacio donde todos puedan participar e involucrarse en el idioma de su corazón o en el idioma en el que sientan más cómodos. Usaremos la interpretación simultánea para crear este espacio. Cuando termine de decir esto, activaremos la interpretación. Si es bilingüe, puede escuchar a todos en su idioma. Cuando seleccione su idioma, puede hacer clic en silenciar audio original. Please select your language and I will check to make sure you can hear me. Give me a thumbs up. Seleccione su idioma y voy a ver si me pueden escuchar. Denme una señal que sí me escuchan. We can turn on interpretation mode.
Thank you so much, Anna. And again, if you have any, well, anyway, we'll go ahead and get started with the program. Matt, can you forward the next slide? Thank you. A little bit about our meeting etiquette and our logistics and housekeeping. Again, we've got Spanish interpretation. Just select the globe and select your language of choice. Again, if you haven't introduced yourself in the chat, please do, your name and where you're from. Please feel free to submit questions at any time in the chat. This is what makes these presentations interesting and valuable to all of us. You will also have an opportunity towards the end of the presentation to unmute and ask questions directly from the panel. We will be recording in English and Spanish and providing this recording to everyone who signed up for this after the fact within a couple of days. And again, thank you so much for joining us to learn more about Proposition 123. Next slide, Matt. Meeting etiquette, please remain muted unless you have a question. And let's be respectful, no inappropriate conduct, language, etc. We're all here to learn and better serve Colorado. And I think we are ready to get into the content of our meeting. I'd love to introduce Jonathan Capelli, a friend of mine, but Jonathan, might have you introduce yourself and give folks background on who you are and why you're here to present on Proposition 123.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Capelli. I'm the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Development Collaborative, which is a coalition of 20 affordable housing providers working in Metro Denver and also across the state, about 20,000 units that they've produced in the last 10 years between them. Really excited to be supporting this proposition and to talk with you a little bit about why our organizations, our membership supports this and why we think this is needed. So next slide, please. So it's probably no surprise to folks. Housing really is the single largest crisis affecting Colorado right now. Housing costs have doubled in the last 10 years. About a third of Coloradans are worried about losing a home right now. And we don't really have the tools to address this issue because of issues with supply. We're actually producing 40% fewer units over the last 10 years than we did in the previous 10 years. So an increasing need for a greater supply, but a reduced ability to deliver on that. And this is showing up not just on wonky tables of folks looking at the statistics and freaking out about the numbers. In polls that were conducted by Gary, we saw that 88% of Coloradans identified housing as a serious problem. I think that when you have, almost 90% of the population seeing housing or seeing an issue as a critical issue, it's no longer a sidebar issue, right? It's something that's affecting us all and should be treated as such. Next slide, please. So part of this collective concern about housing comes from the fact that so many of us are affected directly by it. So about 80% or more than half of Coloradans can't afford to live here any longer. What do we mean by that? We mean that essentially their housing cost burden is financially unsustainable for them to be paying the costs of that they are towards housing. That breaks down into about 83% of renters that are making less than 50%, or sorry, less than $50,000 are housing cost burden, spending more than 30% of their income on housing, and 50.9% of all renters of any income. This really has, it's more than just a statistic. Being housing cost burden, especially when you get way above 30% to 40% or 50% of your income, has huge negative effects on the families themselves, but also society at large. We know that was a 90% increase in first-time homelessness that happened between 2021 and 2022. 12% increase overall, but I think that first stat is extremely important. 90% increase in first-time homelessness. So the more housing cost burden you are, the more likely you are to not be able to weather sort of economic impacts, and more likely you are that you'll end up finding yourself sliding into homelessness. It reduces your ability to save, reduces your ability to invest in children, and it reduces your ability to invest in the economy. There was an interesting study by the Colorado Future Center that showed that for folks on that far left bar there, the 83% of renters making less than $50,000, the margin above the 30% of their income that they're spending on housing collectively for the state of Colorado is $2 billion. So that's $2 billion that aren't being spent on food or clothing, recreation, the economy, not going into businesses, and again, not going back into themselves to increase their financial viability, invest in children, etc. So this is a very troubling number. Next slide, please. This is a really important sort of angle, and I really appreciate Gary putting together this slide, because this is, we often think just in terms of the present, what we're seeing right now, but any policy we create now or don't create is essentially the policy of the future and affecting future generations, right? So let's take the long view. If home prices continue to rise as they have over the last 5 years, the median home in Colorado will cost $1.7 million. Right now, it's around $600,000, which is already unaffordable, right? To qualify for a mortgage on that home, you need an income of over $370,000. Right now, you need over $100,000. So again, it's already unaffordable, but it's just going to get worse. And if rents continue to rise as they have over the last 5 years, a renter would need an income of over $100,000 to just afford the median rent. And of course, we're not seeing this as just a Denver issue. These trends are promising to happen across the state. Many of you might have seen an article that came on the Colorado Sun, I believe it was a few weeks ago, saying that in Eagle County, the county is actually trying to, is pleading with landlords to match them up with teachers in order to ensure that there's housing for teachers in these communities, and saying, just please lower your rents for this math teacher to teach your kids, right? So things are just going to kind of get worse without proactive policy to address that issue. So, Colorado's always had a really small housing budget at the state level. Federal pass-throughs aside, we've seen that the state has had less money on average than the city of Denver, just its budget. And affordable housing providers have sort of seen that this one of the biggest bottlenecks to preventing us from being able to deliver on the housing needs across the state is this lack of funding, which is why, again, we're excited to sort of be supporting this proposition. And I'll turn it over to Mike to talk about how this proposition is going to try to address these issues. Thanks.
Mike, will you take a minute and do an introduction? You've got such an incredible background, and we're so grateful for your leadership.
Oh, delighted to be on, and thank you all so much for joining. My name is Mike Johnston. I'm the CEO of Gary Ventures. We're a philanthropic organization here in Denver. For those of you that don't know us, you may have been familiar with it as the Piton Foundation, used to be our previous name, but we are dedicated entirely to supporting low-income kids and their families getting access to opportunity. So we do early childhood education, we do K-12 education, mental health, workforce development, and of course, affordable housing. And we work on both philanthropy and we work on policy. So we were supporters of the universal preschool measure from several years ago. We were supporters of the measure to repeal the Gallagher Amendment, which to help restore property taxes to local communities. And so we've done a couple of these efforts before, and we're delighted to be partners on this one with folks like Jen and Jonathan. Previous to this, I was a school teacher and a school principal and spent some time in the state legislature, but I've been in Gary for a little more than 3 years and delighted to be on with you tonight. And so I think we'll try to jump into now, okay, what does this measure actually do? And how does it actually work? Because we know you all will care about the details of how it's structured. So the idea is pretty straightforward, that in a world, as Jonathan described, where half of Coloradans can't currently afford to live here, we have to make some significant change. And so what this does is we'll put $300 million a year, or what is about 0.1% of the current income tax that's already in the state budget. It will dedicate $300 million a year to affordable housing without raising taxes. So it dedicates those $300 million. The voters give permission under Tabor for those dollars to be used. And when they do, that money comes out of the general fund, and then $300 million more of what would be tax refunds drop into the general fund. So the important end result is we get $300 million a year into affordable housing. The general fund stays whole, so there's no cuts to education or healthcare or other things. And people still get their tax refund. So in a year like this, people would still get about a $710 tax refund. And the worst case scenario, the Legislative Council says in your blue book, would be maybe about a $40 reduction to your refund in worst case scenario. Best case scenario would actually have no impact on your refunds based on a number of things around economic protection. So that's where the dollars come from. But importantly, those dollars, and I think you can go ahead to the next slide. So that would help us build about 10,000 more units per year, which helps us put on a path over the next 15 or 20 years to fill the total 150,000 to 200,000 unit gap of homes we know we need around the state. And I'll say one more time, since there was a question in the chat. The shorthand way to think of this is the voters give permission for the state to use dollars that would otherwise be focused, they would otherwise go to tax refunds. And so the way Tabor is structured is if the voters approve the use of these dollars in ways that are other than refunds, then the state is allowed to use them. So this is the chance for the voters to give permission without raising taxes to be able to use these dollars for affordable housing. And as Jonathan said, given that 86% of the state think this is a serious issue, this is the first time the state's ever had the chance to vote on affordable housing. There's never been a statewide ballot on affordable housing before. We think the time has come for action on this one. So that's how the funding works. So you can go to the next slide. And then so in addition to the $300 million, that's equivalent to 0.1%, and it builds about 10,000 homes a year. How is this structured in terms of how local governments participate? Well, there are two parts of what a local government would do to participate here. One is we want these local governments to be partners in helping deliver what we need in terms of affordable housing. All local governments we've talked to really want to do this. They just need the revenues to do it. So they would do two things. One is a local government would commit to increasing their stock of affordable housing by 3% a year every year. So imagine that I saw the mayor of Georgetown is on tonight. Imagine you got 1,000 units of housing in Georgetown total. Maybe 100 of those units are affordable units. Then the requirement would be you would need to permit 3 new units a year. That would be 3% of the total amount of affordable housing you have now. You would try to add each year. The idea is that's a small number that makes it attainable for local governments. But when you add that up year over year, you get to a 30% increase in affordable housing stock in 10 years. Those are much bigger numbers than any other state has managed to get to yet. So we're excited about that prospect. The second one is it would ask local governments to establish a process for prioritizing the review of affordable housing proposals so they could get approved more quickly. So one of the biggest costs we know for affordable housing nonprofit developers like Jonathan and others is these projects can take a very, very long time, and that becomes very expensive and complicated for the affordable housing advocates. And so those two things, a city or a county says, we'll set a target to get 3%. We'll create a process for expediting the review of these projects. They're eligible to now receive their share of the $300 million. And any nonprofit, local government could apply directly for these funds. I think if you can go to the next slide. This shows you where those dollars go. We didn't want to create a new bureaucracy or a new state agency. I think we have 2 wonderful organizations that do good work statewide currently in this space. One of those is the Division of Housing, and the other is CHAFA, the Colorado Housing and Financing Authority. So you'll see here 4 big buckets of where the dollars go that Jonathan described earlier. I think what's unique about this proposal is it tries to address the entire continuum of need in affordable housing. You know that there are folks struggling to get off the streets and into any affordable housing unit that are experiencing homelessness that need support. We know that there are bartenders and service workers who are trying to be able to get a unit they can afford to rent. We know we have teachers and firefighters and nurses who want to be able to buy a home and stay in their community long term. And this addresses that continuum of need by putting dollars across that spectrum. You'll see the 2 yellow boxes are boxes that the Division of Housing would administer. So they administer both the grant programs focused on services for folks who are homeless, transitionary housing. This could be rental assistance vouchers, permanent supportive housing, wraparound services. And then on the other side, home ownership, which is focused on both down payment assistance. So if you're a nurse and you're making $60,000 a year and you want to buy a home and you have good credit and you have a good income, but what you don't have is the down payment, this could provide $40,000 of down payment assistance to help you put the down payment on a home and get into a home and stay there long term. And then the middle 2 units that are 2 buckets that are in red, those are both administered through CHAFA, and those are financing for workforce housing focused on rental units. So these are units that would be permanently affordable to people at no more than 30% of their income. And so to Jonathan's point, we describe people who can't afford to live in Colorado who are housing burdened as people who are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. So an example, if you're a first-year teacher and you're making $40,000 a year, if you're spending $15,000 or $20,000 on rent, you're not going to be able to afford the rest of the bills you have. These units would require you wouldn't pay more than 30% of your income to rent. So again, take the scenario, you're a $40,000 a year teacher, 30% of your income would be $12,000 a year. That would be $1,000 a month. So if you're in any one of these rental units, you couldn't be charged more than $1,000 because they are deed restricted to be affordable at 30% of area median of your income or below. So that's how these dollars are structured. The land banking is to help local municipalities or nonprofits who want to acquire land to use in the development of affordable housing. Oftentimes the biggest obstacle to affordable housing is getting land in the first place. So I think I see some questions flowing in through the chat. So I think I will stop there because that's generally where a lot of the questions come up in terms of how it's designed, who's eligible, how they access it. So why don't I stop there and I'll let you quarterback, Jen, on what you want us to jump into when and where.
Let's do it. Thanks, Mike. Lori's asking a question and someone else is backing the question, which is, are folks who will not receive or receive a reduced tax refund the same folks we're trying to provide housing for? Great question.
So the answer is yes. At about these housing programs, particularly the workforce housing and the home ownership, are eligible for Coloradans up to 120% of area median income. In many places, that's $100,000 to $120,000 a year of household income. That is about 60% of the people in the state, and so that means you have a great majority of the state who would be eligible for the funding of these programs, and they are the same folks that are eligible for tax refunds. As you know, the tax refunds were flat this year, so everyone gets the same refund, and so these dollars would directly serve those folks who are receiving refunds. That's 100% true. Great question.
Yeah, great question, Mike. I'm not seeing a ton of questions in the chat. I'm going to open it up and see if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question.
I'm also happy to jump back into a couple more slides if you want me to, Jen, to close out the.
Thank you. That'd be
If
great.
you want me to, I'll close out, and people can ask on anything. Because sometimes, let's see where there. So that gives you the overview of where the dollars go. Happy to come back to that one. You can go to the next slide, Matt. And this gives you a little bit of a sense of support we have statewide. We have almost 200 endorsers now across the state, which include organizations from labor to civil rights to affordable housing groups to county commissioners to mayors to city councilwomen to nonprofits to the Bankers Association, the Hospital Association, Children's Hospital, United Way, everybody that you can think of. We've raised a little bit more than $5 million in the campaign. What we're most excited about that is most of that is coming from nonprofit partners, from foundations and community foundations and nonprofit affordable housing advocates like the Habitat for Humanities or Urban Land Conservancies or others. And we have a very bipartisan approach to this effort. We have both leaders on the right like Dick Wadhams and Josh Penry who've helped us early on, and we have folks like Craig Hughes on the left from Hilltop. And so we've tried to build a real bipartisan coalition to accomplish this. And the polling currently shows about 58% of Coloradans think this is a good idea. There was actually a recent Denver Post article that showed even higher levels of support from an ACLU poll. And it also showed that disproportionately the people that are most inspired to come to the ballot to vote on this are young people and people of color who really feel like this current housing climate is not serving them. So we think there's, among the fastest growing populations in the state, a real hunger to try to address this. So that's a little bit about what the policy does, a little bit about the coalition and the campaign we put together. And our belief is that the most important advocates on this issue are going to be local community leaders like yourselves, who are the ones that people ask what they think about issues like this. And so we think you're the most powerful voices on this topic, and love to answer any questions you have with the hope we can earn your support and have you run into folks at the post office or at when you're getting a burger or in front of your yard and let your neighbors know we think this is a good step for Colorado. So I will gladly stop there and open it up for whatever questions, comments, thoughts people may have.
Thank you so much, Mike. Okay, I'm going to try it again. Please don't be shy. We have folks from Fort Collins to Pueblo, West Slope. If you'd like to unmute and ask a question, we would love to hear what your question is. If not, I've got a few that we can pull out that we hear often. Janet,
Hey,
did you?
this is Lori from Fort Collins.
Hi, Lori.
Full of questions this evening. Love the overall direction of the initiative, but having worked in policy in the past, I know sometimes the devil can be in the details. And I just was wondering if there's anything in this ballot initiative that ensures that the legislature doesn't just zero out money that was already somehow being dedicated to affordable housing because this additional stream of funding is coming in. So I know that's the case a lot of times with like lottery money. People will be like, well, now you have that money, so we'll just take away this other money.
Great question, Lori. And yes, we love the details of the policy because we are policy nerds too, and spent hundreds and hundreds of hours on trying to get this right with local partners like you. So the shorter answer is 100% yes. There is a supplement, not supplant rule, which is the policy term that says this cannot replace existing housing dollars. It has to be in addition to that. I will also say, if you look at, as recently as a couple of years ago, the annual allocation from the state legislature to housing, it was only about $50 million a year annually. So this is about 6 times the current annual budget for state dollars. There are some federal dollars that come in to housing. And so we think this is a really important expansion of those dollars, but that is predicated on not rating the dollars that are already there. So yes, a 6 times expansion of what's happening now, but without allowing them to reduce the current funding that comes in.
Does that work, Lori? Did that answer your question?
Yes, that's great news. Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
We have another
I think there was a follow-up question too in the chat about the question on the impact on refunds. And so I think Kylie had that question. So I'll give you the best case and the worst case scenario. I'll give you the worst case scenario because that's what you'll see printed in the blue book as the worst possible outcome. And that would be on a year like this, where you have a $750 refund. It would be about a $40 impact on that refund. So you'd still get $710, call it about a 7% or so of your total refund. In the best case scenario, there are many scenarios where there's actually no impact on your refund because that $750 refund you got this year came after a bunch of one-time expenditures that the legislature put in place that supplanted refunds. Those will go away next year, and they're about the same amount as this housing measure. So the housing measure just really takes over those revenue streams, and you could still see a $750, you could still see the same total refund you would see in any other year without any changes, as we think the more likely scenario. But I always give you the worst case one, so you know what the worst case is.
Thank you, Mike. Janet, are you trying to unmute?
Yeah, that's fine. I was going to wait because mine's a totally different direction. I work for the City of Golden. I'm the Affordable Housing Policy Coordinator there. And one of the questions that we've had from our councils and others is the 90-day fast track approval process in order for cities to access funds. I came in a little bit late. You might have talked about it, but it seems to exclude, for us, site plans. That's no big deal. We could definitely do that. But when it comes to rezonings, that's very difficult for us to accomplish in a 90-day period. So I see that subdivisions are excluded there, but could you talk about, is rezoning also excluded, or how would that work?
Yeah, Janet, you read the details incredibly well. Yes, you are correct. Zoning is not covered in the 90-day requirement. And if others of us who aren't as in the weeds of this will forgive me 1 minute of kind of deep weeds with Janet, because this is really important. And that, Janet, that 90-day timeline is for each permit or each permitting step. And so if you have, say, that'd be a 90-day clock for a concept plan, or a 90-day for a site development plan, or a 90-day for a building permit. In addition to that, it's important that, you know, if you do your due diligence, you give it back to a developer and they sit on something for 30 or 40 days and don't get you materials back, the clock always stops whenever it's in their hands. And so if they are slow, then that's on them. That's not on you. They have an obligation to be timely as well. And then if you give comments and they have to resubmit because of comments you've given them, that has a 30-day extension for those comments extensions. And so we try to be flexible, but we know communities are trying to do. And a lot of communities are trying to find ways to make this faster, and they have creative ways to do it. And this just tries to recognize that. Also, importantly, puts about $5 to $8 million of grant dollars a year into communities like yours that need to add staffing positions. If you said, okay, great, we'd love to expedite this, we just need more staff, there are grant dollars each year to help you add staff to do that as well, if that's helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great question.
Thanks, Janet. Mike, another one from Lori. It's a great question, which is, what are the biggest objections you're hearing and what are your responses to those objections?
I mean, I would say the thing that we're most proud of, and Joshua knows this, you know, we did last weekend 2 town halls, most of them over in your neck of the woods, Janet, over in Golden and Lakewood and Jeffco. And for those town halls, they always say, we invite the proponents and we'll invite opponents of the measure. And in both instances, they could not get anyone to come on the opponent side because there is not any organized, paid opposition to the measure at this point. So I think that we're really excited about. But I think the questions we get most often are the one that Janet just asked. A lot of local governments will ask about, how does this expedited review process work and how can we make that happen? And then some of the questions that Kylie and others asked in the chat about refunds, just about what is the impact, how is this actually funded? How do you do this without increasing taxes? And what is the implication for me and any of my checkbook? And so I think while we don't get a lot of opposition, those are generally the 2 most common questions we get are around how do you do this without increasing taxes, and how would my local government meet these requirements? And the idea is we provide lots of flexibility for governments to do that. And we think it didn't make any sense to ask voters for more taxes when there's already $3.5 billion of that the state has that the voters have already paid taxes and that would otherwise be refunded. So we just ask voters to allow them to use some of the dollars the state already has.
Thank you, Mike. Emma's asking, you had mentioned the qualifying percentage of income for buying. Is it also defined for the rental side?
It is, and that same thing. So for the workforce housing, that also extends up to 120% of AMI. So that workforce housing unit and home ownership both go up to 120% of AMI. If there are any rural, like Eastern Plains folks or Southern Colorado and the Valley folks in the call, I haven't checked all the, I saw some Pueblo folks. We also, Stephen Cordova, who's was a great advisor to us, who's on the Eastern Plains and runs a housing authority out there, helped us add a provision that if you are in a county that has very low levels of area median income, because the incomes are very low, you can also opt into choosing the state median income option. And so that would be higher and would make more of your teachers or nurses or firefighters eligible. So we provide some flexibility to rural counties to do that as well if they want to. But it is up to 120% for rental or home ownership.
Thank you, Mike. Does anybody else want to unmute and ask a question?
We're assuming that means everybody's totally excited and is going to go out and evangelize to all their neighbors about the importance of 123.
You know, Mike, I might have you reiterate one thing that I haven't heard a lot tonight, that we heard a lot in our other meetings together, is how does this initiative interact with ARPA? You know, how is that relationship with all the funds we have now, right? Because I think there's almost overwhelmed with the resources we have today.
Great point. And I'm going to give it over to Jonathan too, to step in and maybe talk some about how, as a practitioner, what he's seeing out there. So ARPA is the American Rescue Plan. So that was the first big stimulus act that the Biden administration passed. And those included a lot of one-time dollars that could be used for various important items. And one of them was housing. And so there are a couple $100 million that the state has right now for those housing funds. Those are all one-time funds. So those will all be encumbered in the next year and a half, and then they will be gone. So people call it a cliff effect, where you're going to get a bunch of funds, and you're going to go off the cliff, and they're all going to disappear. And there are no ongoing funds to support that. So the idea is, right as the federal funding stops, this funding would pick up and continue that year over year, which allows people in the affordable housing community to be able to plan and prepare for long-term increases in affordable housing spending. But it really perfectly offsets, as the federal dollars stop, these state dollars would pick up. Jonathan, do you want to jump in and chat all about what you did a lot of work on how to spend the one-time dollars and how you see these overlapping and what you see in the ecosystem with affordable housing developers trying to get ready for this?
I think you did a good job of sort of describing why we still need these funds, but I guess a little more detail on it would be that there's a lot of funding that came down, right? But the bills that focus specifically on housing production, which is sort of like this one, this proposition, was a state grants program, which was there's $128 million for housing production, and that one, just like Mike said, will sunset. So that money is being spent as swiftly as possible. I think the first 50% of it, for the first year, is supposed to be in rural Colorado, and then after that gets spent, or after a few months, or after 1 year, if that 50% hasn't been spent in rural Colorado, then it goes to the rest of the state. So there's some good funds that are coming in your guys' direction, but then it's gone. The only exception to that is the revolving loan fund, which is a $150 million fund. But the way revolving loan funds often work, right, is it gets spent down and then you have to wait for it to get paid back. And so it's not like there's $150 million every year. So this is another way of thinking about it, is that this fund is annually as much as all of the ARPA production dollars that we received last year temporarily. I don't know if I said that quite the right direction, but I think you know what I mean. They're $300 million every single year. And that's really, really important for predictability. As developers, both for-profit and nonprofit, that are working in affordable housing realm, or looking in different communities and figuring out how to address their needs, knowing that you're going to have dollars next year. and the year after and the year after to help combine with whatever other programs you're lining up to get funding to develop your housing. There's going to be a mad rush right now, and then without this fund, there will be a huge drop off or steep drop off in production. So it's really important. The other thing that we think is really important about this is that it actually states, this desire to have funding for homelessness, for home ownership, and for rental housing. You guys know, especially in rural Colorado, what a huge concern home ownership is, attracting folks to come work in your communities. I was chatting with some folks out in Craig about how you'll have folks that are coming over to take a job. The intent is eventually to move their families over, and they're just kind of hanging out and renting or staying in motels until they can find a home to purchase, and they can't find one, and then they're going back, right? So the ability to use this fund flexibly for this whole spectrum of need, not just rental housing, and like I said, predictably, is what really distinguishes this from this sort of a short down. I mean, I guess there's a difference between having a hose if we have a fire, right, and a bucket. So this last year was a bucket, thrown on the fire still burning. This is a hose.
Nice, Jonathan. Suze, thank you for raising your hand. Go ahead and unmute and ask.
Okay, now I am going through an interesting situation up here. Actually, on Thursday, we have a petition to even form a housing cooperative. Can you hear me?
You're a little hard to hear.
Okay, hold on just 1 second, please.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. This should be a little bit better now.
Thank you. Yep.
Not a problem. I'm so sorry about that. Up here, we are having a hearing for a housing authority. And if I heard you correctly, there's actually going to be grant funding to actually pay for the position, because that's the one thing they're really pushing back on, is that who's going to pay for a housing authority administrator. I think it actually pays for itself in the long run, but they're going to ask me this, and how can I answer this?
It's a great question. And yes, you are right, which is this does provide grant dollars for local governments to apply for, to use to staff up whatever needs they have to be able to make the permitting and approval process run more smoothly or more expeditiously. And so that is absolutely, it's about $5 to $8 million of funds a year that local municipalities or housing authorities could apply for. And so that is definitely true. You can tell them there are dollars to do that.
Thank you.
You
Thanks,
bet.
Mike.
And I agree with you. It pays for itself over time. But yes, in the upfront part, we got to help subsidize it to make sure people can have the capacity.
Mike, we're going to go to Celeste in the chat. She says, counties like mine, Gunnison County, has an overwhelming amount of public lands and not a lot of land options for building and very strict county land use regs. How do you see this working in areas with limited resources, labor, building materials, land?
Yeah, great question, Celeste. And actually, we talked about Gunnison County a fair amount. My dad lived in Gunnison County back in the 50s, and so and I know it a little bit. The idea there are a couple areas of focus. One is, and actually, when I talk to people like Jody Cole, who runs the Housing Authority in Mesa County in Grand Junction, she was one of the big pushers early on to create the land banking idea, which is in a lot of municipalities, the ability to acquire the land in the first place is the biggest challenge. And so being able to have dollars to help do that mattered a lot. I think the other one in your question is how do we use public lands to be able to partner with affordable housing projects? So we see that a lot in some parts of the state where they're either school districts or the state land board or others who are using available public land to enter into partnerships. This would allow you to have dollars you could either use to buy or lease that land from the state land board or from other public landholders, or to incentivize them to come into partnership. And so I think that's the key. And then the other one is to the regulatory challenge. This is part of what the purpose of the expedited review process is to eliminate some of the red tape that might get in the way of affordable housing getting permitted in the first place or getting approved. As those counties and cities now have a chance and an incentive to make sure they're helping be good partners to you and finding land that can be developed and developing affordable housing in a responsible way. And you can do partnerships between counties and cities. So say if Crested Butte wants to be able to build more affordable housing, but doesn't have access to land, they could partner with Gunnison County, who has access to land, but maybe doesn't have as much demand or have as much interest. And so the measure allows for flexibility and partnerships between the counties and the cities to do those projects together. But we think that land banking, plus the available resources, plus the encouragement for them to adopt regulatory practices that are more efficient in terms of approving affordable housing, help in exactly the scenario that you laid out.
And I would just add, Mike, that we find, and Durango's similar, right? We have forest, public lands, and 2 tribes that it's so much more expensive. So Celeste, I think of this funding as another way to really fill that large gap in our communities that have such limited development opportunity. So I don't know if that helps.
And actually, can I just look back at your question, Celeste? I think I missed the last sentence that you put in there, which is also about how do you address the issues of limited resources around labor and building materials. I mean, we talked about land. I think it's really important what you said about labor and building materials. And this is where, to Jonathan's point, what's so important is when you have a stable, predictable revenue stream that's available every year, year in and year out, then the market can respond and people say, oh, you know, I will go and apply for this job or enter this profession if I know there's an opportunity year over year. I will bring my development company to Gunnison County if I know I can build year over year. The best example for this, I think, is in the transportation bill the legislature passed a couple of years ago that finally put sustainable permanent funds to transportation each year. And all of a sudden you see these transportation organizations thriving, and they have employees that are coming and staying permanently. Because before, when every year you got to bid for a new project, not sure if there's money or not, there's a lot of risk. People won't sign up for that. Once you have a stable revenue stream, I think the market really responds and labor comes along, materials come along. We have innovation for ways to reduce the cost of construction to be able to make these things affordable to build. And so I think that's an important part of how you get there.
Thanks, Mike. Kylie, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi there, Kylie Hipschman from United Way of Larimer County. Quick question for you all. Can you share a few more details about how nonprofits can access some of these funds if they're working in affordable housing or housing and homelessness?
I'm really glad. Great question, Kylie. So the important part here is a city or a county just kind of declares themselves open for business. If they say, we want to help build affordable housing, we're going to set a target to meet 3%. We're going to create an expedited review process. All that does is say, okay, great. Weld County is open for business. Larimer County is open. Greeley's open. But then any organization, any nonprofit, any community group, any developer can apply for those dollars directly. So, you know, whether it's a habitat or whether it's a community college or whether it's a school or whether it's a hospital or whether it's an affordable housing nonprofit, anyone is eligible to apply for these dollars. So a nonprofit could apply directly to Division of Housing or directly to CHAFA for a project that you all wanted to support in Larimer, Weld, Greeley, Fort Collins, wherever. That's open to any applicant. That's a really important distinction. I'm sorry I wasn't clear enough about that earlier.
Thank you, Mike. We have another question from Jimmy. Building new homes will increase tax revenue everywhere. Is there a way to capture that revenue and dedicate it to building more housing to meet needs so we can catch up with supply, lowering housing costs? So this is kind of how do you set up your local housing trust fund? And Jonathan, you and I have talked about this with a number of our projects, right? This was the direction we were pushing communities to go to deal with the cliff effect. So all of it's very relevant. I don't know, Mike or Jonathan, which one of you want to take this?
Jonathan, you want to jump in?
Not really. I think that
I'm happy to do this one, Jonathan. Do you want me to do this one?
Go for it, Jen.
So Jimmy, this is local land use policy. So I mean, you're talking about capturing the revenue, the property taxes perhaps, or other taxes from the building, but there's a lot of ways that we can create policy locally that can offset the cost of new construction to be able to do more affordable housing. Sometimes it's referred to as inclusionary zoning. Sometimes we can do linkages. So there's a lot of technical ways to do this, but it all happens at the local level. And so what I would say is, again, what's wonderful if Proposition 123 passes is local communities have an opportunity to take a look at what they need, make a plan, and 123 can help with the funding side. They may decide to do some other things, right, Jimmy, to augment locally, but that's really kind of a local policy. If anyone wants to add to that. Do we have anyone else who would like to unmute and ask a question? Mike, should we tell people if they're interested in supporting, how they can support, where they can find information? All the good things.
Yes, that would be great. And actually, Joshua, if you want to come up on mute and tell folks how they can website and access the endorsement and the rest, I'll let you jump in.
Absolutely. Hi, all. I'm Joshua Posner. I'm on Mike's team kind of as our outreach lead. And again, just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your Tuesday to hop on and join us. I just posted the link to our website in the chat. Yes, on 123co.com. You can find more information about the ballot measure there as well. And as Mike said, if you're interested in learning more, if you need yard signs, if you'd like to formally add your organization's name to our growing endorsement list, you can find a form on there on the Get Involved page. You can fill that out, and I will follow up with you very shortly thereafter, and would be really excited to talk with you more about the measure, other ways we can utilize your organizations, and get more materials your way. So those are the best ways to get involved, and we'll look forward to connecting with you soon.
One other reminder I was going to add, Jen, as I was just chatting with Jimmy about Pueblo in the chat. We are also doing some kind of town halls on Proposition 123 around the state. So like Jimmy, we are going to be down in Pueblo in the next few weeks. We're doing one in the Springs. We are doing one up in Fort Collins as well. So I was thinking, I think Lori, to your questions, I think you're up in Fort Collins. So we will be coming to do events in those communities with a lot of local leaders. And so if you all want to come join, bring people, learn more, will be local media and others. I think our goal is just, we think that this really is decided community by community. And so while yes, there'll be digital ads and TV ads around the state, I think the most important one is to raise awareness in the local communities where people are going to see this happen outside their door. And so we can also, if you come to the website, or we can show you where these potential events are, if you want to join for any of them.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you, Jonathan. I think this is a wrap. Thank you everyone for your time tonight. And again, if you're interested, visit the website and come see one of the live events. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks so much, y'all. Really great to see you. Appreciate your help on this once in a generation chance. Let's go get this done for affordable housing.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.